Hello, and welcome to a bonus box of Warhammer 40k's Grim History from Beyond. I'm Zeckthar, and today we'll be going to talk about one of the most important campaigns of the Horus Heresy, known as the Burning of Prospero.
Now, before we get into the campaign itself, we have to go back a ways to the two brothers this campaign would intertwine in a debacle that would change the Imperium of Man forever. I speak of the Sorcerer and the Wolf, Magnus the Red and Leman Russ. Now, by the time Magnus was discovered by the Emperor Prospero, he had already surpassed the tutelage of any of the sorcerers on his planet. The Emperor took Magnus as a student and began to teach him the powers of the warp. Yet the Emperor knew that Magnus was a very powerful psyker and possessed an unquenchable thirst for knowledge. He believed that it was dangerous for his son to remain ignorant of the secrets of the Immaterium and the ancient dark intelligences that resided there. And so, the Emperor showed Magnus the truth of the warp. Unfortunately for the Emperor, Magnus had already discovered the entities of the warp, and just like his father, thought he could control and use them. So he did what lots of young sons do when their fathers tell them not to do something. He told his father he would abide by his wishes, yet continue to research into the warp. Now, also, like sons that disobey their fathers, Pops is going to eventually find out, and that's not a good thing, if you're Magnus at least. But Magnus did a fairly good job hiding his sorcery, and the Emperor, being pleased with his son, granted him command of the 15th Legion, known as the Thousand Sons. Now, like their gene father, the Thousand Sons had inherited powerful psychic talents, as their gene seed organs possessed their Primarchs' own psychically potent genes. However, the Legion's gene seed was also genetically unstable, and often produced unwanted mutations known as the Flesh Change by the Legionnaires. The Flesh Change was much feared amongst the Thousand Sons, as the spiral of degenerate mutation, ultimately reducing a proud Thousand Sons Astartes into a mindless mutant abomination, similar to a Chaos Spawn. The majority of those Thousand Sons afflicted by the Flesh Change were put into stasis by the Legion in hope that someday, in the future, a cure would be found that could reverse the onset of these crippling mutations. The number of the active Astartes within the 15th Legion soon began to dwindle to dangerously low levels as a result of the ravages of this constant mutation. Some within the Imperium called upon the Emperor to declare the Legion hopelessly corrupted and remove them from the Great Crusade's active order of battle. By the time the Thousand Sons were reunited with their Primarch Magnus, they numbered only 1,000 active Astartes, literally the Thousand Sons of Magnus. Through hidden means, after restoration to his Astartes, Magnus gained the knowledge required to cure his Legion's tendencies towards rampant mutation. This effort had a visible cost, and a hidden one. Magnus lost his right eye. The skin became smooth where the eye had previously been. To stop the mutations, Magnus had willingly consorted with demonic entities from the warp, whose true nature he had not at the time understood. He was unknowingly fooled by the Chaos God Tzinch into believing he had bested the warp entities, and that he had genuinely found the cure for his Legion, though in fact he had only made a devil's bargain for the sorcerer's power required to stop temporarily the mutations. Now, all of this was a ruse crafted by Tzinch to make Magnus even more arrogantly beholden to his psychic gifts, to drive him to pursue more corrupted forms of sorcery that would eventually lead to his corruption to chaos. Because of the setbacks that had befallen the Thousand Sons, and the continuing suspicion of many of the Imperium towards the Thousand Sons' use of psychic abilities, and the flaws of their gene seeds, the Primarch and his Astartes developed an extremely close emotional bond. Approximately 100 Terran years after it had begun, the Thousand Sons Legion was finally permitted to join the great effort as the 28th Expedition Fleet of the Great Crusade. He even restored his sons, who had been afflicted with the Flesh Change and placed in stasis, making the 15th Legion whole once again. The Legion quickly adopted Prospero as its new homeworld, and many of Magnus's followers from amongst the sorcerer's cults on the planet were recruited into the Legion's ranks. Magnus also secretly taught the Thousand Sons the ways of the sorcerers of Prospero, and to embrace their psychic talents as a gift rather than suffer them as a curse. Within a short period of time, the Thousand Sons had become a secret cabal of powerful warp sorcerers. Throughout the Great Crusade, the psychic talents of the Thousand Sons proved useful innumerable times, as the 15th Legion fought bravely in multiple campaigns, leaving few in doubt of their achievements. However, there were those Primarchs, such as Mortarion of the Death Guard and Corvus Corvax of the Raven Guard, who could never bring themselves to fully trust Magnus and his 1,000 Sons because of their own strong feelings against the use of sorcery and psychers. The Emperor at first ignored these whispers of traitorous sorcery for a couple of reasons. The first and foremost was he knew both Corvus and Mortarion had a deep mistrust for psychers, not just sorcery. And the second was Magnus had proven that he was a powerful psyker, not a sorcerer. In fact, with the help of Jagatai Khan and Sanguinius, Magnus had developed the Librarian Program, a training program for psychers that were being discovered throughout the legions of the Astartes. Yet, as rumors of sorcery progressed to a point that even his Praetorian son, Rogel Dorn, would not fight by his brother Magnus's side, the Emperor began to truly think that his son perhaps was still dabbling with sorcery. This was put on the forefront by his executioner, the Wolf King, Leman Russ, after the Arc Cluster campaign. Now, before we get into this debacle, a couple things. Leman Russ was the second Primarch found by the Emperor on the death world of Fenris. The planet of Fenris is a cold, desolate place where only the hardiest of humans live. As opposed to Prospero, a highly civilized world, Fenris is a place of survival. Small barbaric tribes and legends of old gods are taught by firelight. Mighty men are killed by massive Fenrisian wolves as they hunt the great mammoths, slaughtered by white bears as they make camp, or simply freeze in the harsh environment. Thoughts of enlightenment are few, replaced by better ways to survive the death world. Those that live here know nothing of chaos or the warp, but they do know of sorcery. Psychers do occasionally pop up on the world, and those people are considered even more dangerous than the wilds that surround them. They are called witches, warlocks, and sorcerers, and are normally slain outright before they can kill those around them. This was the world Leman Russ came from, and needless to say, he was not a fan of psychers. Yet, as the Great Crusade progressed, some of his own men began to show signs of the ability to bend the warp to their will. Ironically, instead of inducting these men into the Librarians, Russ formed his own corps of psychers called Rune Priests. Now, the Rune Priests were one of the several subdivisions within the Priests of Fenris, the interconnected orders which provided for the physical, spiritual, and technological needs of the Fourth Company, occluded to outsiders beneath webs of what outwardly seemed superstitious and barbarous, but instead the repositories of the Legion's true history, the keeper of its secrets, and the masters of its lore. There were several divisions of particular prominence, with the warrior mystics known as the Caster of Runes being one of them. They were undeniably an order of psychers who considered themselves a breed apart from the librarians of the other legions. Those chosen as the Casters of Runes had the psycher's gift, but treated them warily, as a potential curse as well as a blessing, reaching for their powers only through a deliberate scheme of cognitive shielding within their own minds, and aided by a unique lattice of psychomimetic pattern field technology incorporated into their armor as a safeguard both against hostile outside forces and drawing down too much power from the Imperium themselves. They manipulated their powers through these little understood runic matrices and adapted Fenrisian rituals, and provided the Fourth Legion with prognostication and shielded from warp threats. Eventually, this bygone specialty rank of the Space Marine Legions evolved into the present-day role of the Rune Priest for the Space Wolves chapter. Now, I'm not going to suggest that Russ was ignorant enough to not understand there were similarities between the Rune Priests and the Librarians of other legions. I do think he thought of them differently. The training of librarians was beyond his want or need of understanding. And while I don't think he understood librarians very well, he did understand Rune Priests to a degree. Rune Priests dealt in the old magics, the magics of his people. They were first and foremost priests and historians. The Rune Priests of old, in fact, were very much like a crossbreed between a librarian and a chaplain. Not only this, but precautions were placed on these early priests, something that was lacking with the librarians. In fact, at the time they were not known as Rune Priests, but the Priests of Fenris, which were broken into 3 distinctive groups. Through my research, I also believe that while Leman Russ had no particular liking to the librarians, he didn't despise them either. It seems the ones that he despised and hated were of one variety: Magnus's boys. Now, this might have been for a number of reasons before the Arc Cluster campaign. Perhaps the fact that the whole Legion was psychers and dealt with war in a way he thought cowardly. Or maybe they simply didn't smell right. I mean, they don't call him the Wolf King for nothing. On the other side of the scale, Magnus wasn't particularly impressed with Russ and his ilk either. He viewed them as many of his brothers did. Barbaric, backwards, and warmongers that live for bloodshed. Now, remember, Magnus came from Prospero, a place where survival was put on the back burner for enlightenment. There was no need for a survivalist view on such a civilized world. As far as Magnus was concerned, the Wolf King was barely more intelligent than the massive Fenrisian wolves that guided him into battle. Now, this all came to a head at the Arcreach Cluster campaign. The Arcreach Cluster had been discovered by the Word Bearers Legion, 47th Expedition Fleet. It was a group of binary stars occupied by a number of belligerent planetary empires that rejected the Imperium's offer to become part of the Emperor's growing Imperium. When negotiations broke down between Imperial representatives and the Phoenix Court, the representative body of 6 systems of the Arcreach Cluster, hostilities commenced. The first 4 systems easily fell to the combined efforts of the Space Wolves and the Word Bearers. The army waged a genocidal campaign that laid waste to the obstinate worlds, while the Word Bearers' Ashen Circle destroyed much of the culture of the Arcreach Cluster, hunting down works of false doctrine and those who pervaded, and consigning both to destruction in eradicating flame. The 2 legions continued the prosecution of this campaign for the next 2 years, until only 2 worlds still resisted Imperial efforts, thanks in no small part to the Evanians, who lived in silver towers on top of the tallest mountain peaks of the Arcreach Secundus, which was known to the local inhabitants as the Helosia. It was soon decided that in order to ensure a successful compliance, a greater Imperial presence must be felt. To this end, Leman Russ decided that he would send for assistance from the Thousand Suns in the nearby Agora system to help bring the 6th and final world, Shrike, into Imperial compliance. When the 15th Legion finally arrived, they found themselves deployed at a more frantic war pace than what they were accustomed to. The Space Wolves' compliance operation were conducted swiftly, and over the next 6 months, the army continued to spearhead the efforts on Shrike. The Imperial ground forces found themselves being viciously attacked by varied and hostile avian creatures almost incessantly, which forced the Imperials to modify their weapons for point defense in order to clear the skies around them. These vicious avians were known by the local inhabitants as snow shrikes that made short work of the Imperial forces during multiple assaults. This earned the planet the name Shrike by the Imperial forces. Despite the punishing pace of the campaign, the Thousand Suns helped play an instrumental role in the final defeat over the Evanians when they took the objective named Raven's Ire 93. This final battle was won in a matter of hours, which only a fraction of casualties incurred by Imperial forces. The Evanians' surviving leaders and military forces withdrew and retreated to their capital world of Helosia, with the precognitive abilities of the Thousand Suns' Corvadi cult members. They were able to determine the location of hidden enemy forces, whom the Space Wolves savagely killed with their warriors, while the Word Bearers burned their fortresses with purifying flame. Even after achieving victory, tension between the Space Wolves and the Thousand Suns continued to boil over, until it finally came to a head during the Battle of Phoenix Crag, Shrike's capital city. The Crimson King had become disgusted by what he saw as wanton destruction and near genocide committed by the Space Wolves to the planet's population. The Space Wolves pointed out to their cousin Legion that the Evanians were an unrepentant and degenerate society who refused to accept the Imperial truth. Soon tensions flared, and several of the Space Wolves charged the Thousand Suns. The warriors of the 15th Legion utilized their deadly psychic abilities and slew several Fenrisian wolves, as well as disabling the bodies of the Space Wolves themselves. In the midst of the fighting, disaster struck, in the form of one of the Thousand Suns, a Pavoni cult member named Hastur, when he succumbed to the dreaded flesh change after overexerting his psychic powers. This caused his body to spontaneously mutate uncontrollably, which caused panic within the ranks of the Thousand Suns, and resulted in further mutations amongst some of its members. A surging wave of power erupted as Magnus the Red came forth and stepped towards the hideously transformed Hastur, who seemed to reach out to Magnus as though to embrace him, and the Primarch opened his arms to receive him with forgiveness and mercy. Suddenly, A thunderous bang sounded, and Hastur's body exploded as a single explosive round detonated within his chest. Silence ascended as the heavy tink sound of a monstrous expended brass casing struck the ground. It was the Wolf King himself who had ended Hastur's suffering. The Wolf King walked calmly towards his brother Primarch, as both sides readied themselves to make war upon one another. Total war between the two legions seemed imminent. Fortunately, disaster was just barely averted when Primarch Lorgar interposed himself between his brothers, and through his masterful oratory, managed to calm the tense situation. Magnus refused to stand by as the wolves ravaged Helosia, but Russ retorted that this world was discovered by his legion, and therefore it was his to do as he saw fit. The people of this world had chosen to fight the Imperium, and therefore had chosen death. As the Wolf King departed, he turned to face Magnus once more, and swore a blood oath against the Crimson King. "This is not over. Blood of Fenris is on your hands, and there will be a reckoning between us, Magnus. This I swear upon the blade of Molnar." It was a promise that one day soon there would be a reckoning between both of them. The Wolf King then slashed his blade across his palm and let his blood spill to the ground. He then threw back his head and howled, and his warriors added their voice to their master's cry, a lament for the dead and grim warning of things to come. Now, Magnus probably assumed that Lehman meant to do him bodily harm, which he probably did at this point, but was mistaken that that was all the Wolf King could conjure in his little mind. Now, lots of people think of Leman Russ very much like Magnus does. A warmonger, a tool simply used by the Emperor to slaughter his enemies, only smart enough to understand the pointy end of the sword was part you stuck into the enemy. The truth couldn't be farther from this, and while he held to his barbaric ways of Fenris, Leman Russ was anything but stupid. And so instead of coming for his brother in violence, Leman made plans to take the thing that Magnus truly loved, his wizardry. Thus Leman Russ added his voice to those that swore Magnus and his ilk were sorcerers, which became a final nail in the coffin for Magnus. The Emperor, hearing yet another of his sons declaring Magnus a sorcerer, decided to finally deal with the problem, and thus the Council of Nikaea came to be. Now, if you want to know more about this, feel free to check out our Vox called The Council of Nikaea. Now, to give you the gist, the Librarian Project was shut down, and all librarians were told to return to their legions and make no more use of the war. This included the Thousand Sons, as well as their Primarch Magnus. In conclusion, the Emperor gave his son a final warning. "If you treat with the warp, Magnus, I shall visit destruction upon you, and your legion's name will be struck from the Imperial records for all time." The only psychers that weren't sanctioned by this edict were the Navigators, Astropaths, and ironically, the Stormseers of the White Scars and the Rune Priests of the Space Wolves. This last bit surely stuck in the craw of Magnus, as much as it brought a smile to Lehman's face. Yet Magnus refused to stop learning about sorcery, and continued on in secret, along with his sons. It wasn't much later that the pinnacle of the Horus heresy swayed on the tip of a spear. Horus was wounded through a nefarious ruse by Erebus, and he was taken to the Serpent Lodge, where his mind wandered into the Immaterium, guided by a disguised Erebus. Magnus meditated on Prospero, peering into the warp with his one good eye, and foresaw the pact with chaos that the dying War Master had made to save his life. He also foresaw the epic events that were yet to unfold in the galaxy and could prove dire to the survival of the Imperium. Horus's betrayal, the death of some of his Primarch brothers, and the action of those who would betray their oaths to the Emperor. The only fate the vision did not reveal was Magnus's own. Burdened with the terrible information provided by the precognitive vision, Magnus gathered about him the secret cabal of his legion's sorcerer librarians to discuss and interpret the meaning and implications of these dire portents. After much deliberation, they resolved to break the proscriptions of the Edicts of Nikaea and psychically contact the Emperor on Terra to warn him of Horus's impending betrayal. Magnus used the power of his legion's greatest sorcery to convey the news of the impending civil war to the Emperor himself on Terra via a sorcerer's spell, rather than use the legal but unreliable means of astrotelepathy. Now, why Magnus chose to warn his father in this fashion is not clear. for surely he knew the Emperor would recognize the taint of chaos on this forbidden sorcery. Personally, I think he thought it a necessity. Astro-telepathy was slower, and like I mentioned, unreliable. It wouldn't surprise me as well if he chose to use sorcery as an almost, "I told you so, father, I know what I'm doing." Regardless, using an astral projection spell, the spirit of Magnus the Red hurled towards Terra through the warp. While in the Immaterium, Magnus came across a webway corridor that led to Terra but found the barrier impenetrable. But then an anonymous entity within the warp whispered seductively to him, offering to provide the Primarch with additional power in order to breach the webway. Magnus seized upon the entity's offer, breaching the barrier and bursting into the Emperor's throne room. This act penetrated the powerful psychic wards the Emperor had raised around the Imperial Palace and allowed the warp entities to penetrate through the human extensions of the webway and launch an assault against Terra itself, killing thousands of the Mechanicus adepts who had been laboring with the Emperor on his great work. With this breach, the Emperor's work was undone. Horrified, the Primarch spirit returned to his corporal body on Prospero. There, he received a vision from Tzinch, the mysterious entity that had enabled him to breach the webway. The architect of fate informed Magnus that it was his destiny to serve the will of the ruinous powers. The Emperor was furious at Magnus's willful violation of the proscriptions against the use of sorcery set by the Council of Nikaea, especially because Magnus had used the webway to reach Terra in time, and his actions had damaged the secret webway project, a centuries-long attempt to use this Eldar construct to render dangerous warp travel obsolete and physically connect all the worlds of the Imperium of Man together using human versions of the Eldar's webway portals. The Emperor saw Magnus as a traitor of the Imperial's ideas, not his beloved son Horus, who he did not believe was capable of betraying him. In his anger, the Emperor ordered Leman Russ to bring Magnus swiftly to Terra to account for his actions before the Emperor. However, the treacherous War Master Horus had other plans in mind. Ignorant of the changes in his brother Primarch since his corruption by the Chaos Gods, Russ was convinced by Horus's silver tongue to launch an all-out planetary assault on the sedacious Thousand Sons rather than attempt to negotiate with them or bring their Primarch Magnus the Red back to Terra peacefully. Now, back on Prospero, Magnus had finally understood. After his forced psychic entry into the Hall of the Golden Throne and his direct mental communication with the Emperor, that he had been manipulated by Tzinch, with whom he had apparently unknowingly consorted while desperately looking for a way to stop the emergence of the psychic mutations that were threatening to destroy his legion. In an act of repentance and sacrifice, and to show his father that he and his legion were loyal to the end, he did not warn the defenders of the planet or his legion of the coming Imperial attack. On the contrary, he imposed a psychic veil on the planet so the Thousand Sons would have no clue of the impending assault. He also dispersed the Thousand Sons Legion's fleet far from Prospero. He knew that Tzinch wanted the Thousand Sons and Space Wolves to slaughter each other, and he wanted to stop these plans, even if it meant the sacrifice of his legion and homeworld. Therefore, the Space Wolves' attack on the Thousand Sons' homeworld, Prospero, came as a complete surprise to his people and the Astartes Legion who protected them. Now, recovered records of the 15th Legion show that no information regarding the Imperial Censure Fleet, or even the Emperor's displeasure, was ever disseminated to the Legion. As the combined armada of Leman Russ and Constantin Veldor drew ever closer to the world of Prospero, the Thousand Sons busied themselves with mundane maintenance and their own esoteric training, oblivious to any threat. No attempt was made by the 15th Legion or the various regiments of the Prosperan Spire Guard to fortify any of the key defensive positions within the city of Tizca, the only large-scale urban settlement on Prospero to survive the Age of Strife. In several cases, there were even reported disappearances of key Legion and civilian personnel who appeared to have stumbled across information related to the fleet's approach and then were silenced, with the evidence at hand suggesting the use of potent memory-altering telepathy to quell any unrest at the sudden disappearances, a feat few even at legions such as the Thousand Sons were capable of. As the Imperial sanctioned fleet translated from the warp and burned in towards Prospero, it became evident that the planet had strangely not activated its planetary defenses. The Prosperan defense grids were non-functional at every layer of security, from the outer orbital defense platforms to the close surface planetary defense cannons. Individual cities were still screened by active defensive measures, but that was standard Imperial operating procedure and not a response to an approaching threat. There were signs, though, that civilian ships had fled or were fleeing the planet and the star system in considerable numbers. Some of the escaping vessels were overtaken and boarded by the Imperial fleet. Their crews and passengers were taken captive and interrogated by the Space Wolves' rune priests, so that every useful scrap of intelligence about the target could be gathered. With no response from the ground, the Imperial Armada moved into high orbital anchor above Prospero and assumed a geostationary assault pattern. Thousands of weapons were trained on the planet below. Energy weapons, mass drivers, and kinetic bombardment cannons. It was at this moment we get a little clarity on who Leman is. Even though he was told to wreak havoc on Prospero, he hesitates. As much as he dislikes Magnus, some might even say hate, it does not burn so hot in his chest that he wishes to kill his own brother. Before committing his forces to the attack, Leman Russ still attempted to communicate with his brother Magnus. Believing that Caspar Ansbach Hauser was a hidden one of the Thousand Sons, Russ attempted to speak to Magnus through him, declaring his fleet's approach and making a request to send away the civilians and surrender. As Hauser was not a hidden one, unfortunately, but actually a pawn of chaos designed to appear as one, the message was never received. Without attempting normal communications via Vox, Leman Russ ordered the attack. Regardless of his feelings, he had a job to do, ordered by his father through the War Master himself. All thoughts of sympathy left his mind, replaced by the quickening of his blood and a tight smile that crept onto his face. This is what he was born to do, wage war. His hand inched towards his sword as he briskly marched towards his personal Stormhawk. The starships drifted sedately, like grand liners in a regatta amongst the stars. Leman Russ's flagship, the battle barge, Hrafnel, opened the orbital assault, its massive weapon systems etching lines of icy light into the surface of Prospero. Moments later, the rest of the Imperial fleet opened fire. The first bombs from the Space Wolves fleet struck Prospero just before dawn. The Prosperan orbital defense platforms were caught completely unawares. 1 minute their augurs had been silent. The next, a buckshot spread of torpedoes, already arcing towards their orbital batteries and missile defenses. Most were knocked out before they were able to launch a single weapon or power up a single gun. The lucky few that managed to get off a quick snapshot were bracketed and obliterated moments later. Though Magnus had chosen to keep his legion blind to the approach of the Emperor's vengeance, as he wished to display his own repentance for his actions, the telekinetic sorcerers of the Legion's Raptora cult maintained a constant psychic kind shield over Prospero's capital city of Tizca. Not even Magnus the Red could undo that protection without someone noticing and wondering why. The first warning anyone in Tizca had of the imminent Imperial attack was a hot wind that seemed to come straight from the sky, pressing down on the city like the pressure before a storm. It tasted of metal and burnt oil. Static leapt from the Tizcan pyramid's tops, sparking from silver tower to silver tower. The gray pre-dawn sky erupted in light as the lower clouds were lit with an inner radiance. This was swiftly followed by a tremendous crash of atmospheric discharge, like thunder without the lightning. Multiple sonic booms from the incoming hypersonic projectiles shattered the silence of the sleeping city, and those citizens of Tizca who still dreamed were shaken from their beds by the echoes of percussive blasts rolled across the urban landscape. Like a stabbing finger of raw light, the first energy lance from the orbiting Imperial fleet struck Prospero a kilometer northwest of Tizca. The total saturation of the target area ensured that Prosperan capital city was completely engulfed, enough to level a continent's worth of metropolises. Yet Tizca endured. The telekinetic kind shields of the Thousand Sons Raptora cult were the strongest defenses any city in the Imperium could boast. Harder than the thickest adamantium, and more unyielding than layer upon layer of standard gravitic void shields. The invisible umbrella of telekinetic protection soaked up the violence of the bombardment through a fearsome cost of the Astartes who maintained it. Magnus watched as the light storm blistered and burst over his beautiful city. The sky was stained a bloody orange as air-bursting incendiary rounds burned the clouds away, and a tear fell from his eyes. He watched the beautiful land around Tizca die. The forests were burned to ash, and the wild grasslands blazed with secondary fires, reducing the unspoiled countryside to a wasteland in a matter of minutes. The desolation of Prospero was complete. Now, the Primarch knew how his father felt about his psychic intrusion into the imperial palace and his continued use of sorcery. He accepted his punishment for his arrogance and flagrantly disobeying the emperor's wise edicts. Shortly after the bombardment began, the imperial invaders arrived by the thousands. Wave after wave of dropships, assault boats, and gunships sped inbound to the planet's surface. Behind them came bulkier cargo transports bearing armored vehicles and artillery pieces. The kind shields of the Raptora cult could not protect Tizca from the attack, but their cover was no longer needed. The bombardments from orbit had ceased. The squadrons of Stormbird gunships led the charge, skimming low over the water towards Tizca's port. Hundreds of Imperial crafts flew over the churning seas, leaving foam breakers in their wake. The idea that any enemy could reach the surface of Prospero to launch an assault had been discounted, and as a consequence, there were no Prosperan anti-aircraft batteries to meet the oncoming invaders. The route into Tizca was wide open. The first gunship to land, an enormous Stormbird with steel-gray sides and the image of twin wolves painted on its blunt prow, smashed into the eastern quarter of the capital that was known as Old Tizca, blasting its way in with a salvo of missiles and the blast of cannon fire. Landing skids deployed at the last second, and the aircraft came down hard in the wreckage. No sooner had it set down than the assault ramp dropped, and Leman Russ himself set foot on Prospero, the first invader ever to do so. He roared to the skies, and the devastation wrought by his fleet above was pleasing to him. Two enormous Fenrisian wolves howled at his side, and a score of his most powerful Astares fought their way into the port. As the Space Wolves drew first blood, Prospero's military responded. The citizens' militias of Tizca rose in defense of their city, gathering what arms they could and taking up firing positions on rooftops and at windows. No one was fool enough to think they would be anything more than irritants to the Space Wolves, but to let the invaders simply walk into Tizca without a fight was as abhorrent as it was unthinkable. The Skyguard Air Command launched every squadron of their two-man skimmers from their hangars to the south. These disc-like anti-gravitic aircraft were armed with heat lancers and missile pods, and the sky above the city became a frantic mess of gunfire, streaking missiles, explosions, and dogfights as the two forces dueled for supremacy. The Imperial Army regiments of the Prosperan Spire Guard attempted to bear the brunt of the Astartes' assault, meeting the barbarian warriors of the Space Marines bravely but futilely on the field of battle. The Spire Guard, already on high alert after the commencement of the orbital bombardment, moved out en masse under the guidance of the Thousand Sons Corvidae cult, ordering to defend Tizca. They did not falter from the order despite the overwhelming odds arrayed against them. Elements of the 15th Prosperan Assault Infantry, under the Captain Sochem Vithara, occupied upper slopes of Old Tizca, anchoring their defense between the fire-wreathed pyramid of the Pyrrhaic cult and the Skelmus Tholus, which lay a kilometer to the west of their position, and the Corvidae cult's own pyramid. Vithara set up his command post in the vestibule of Kratos Gallery, the oldest repository of artwork and sculpture on Prospero. In the southwest quadrant of the city, the Prospero Assault Pioneers rallied what little was left of their soldiers after the avalanches caused by the orbital shelling swallowed 3 of their barracks. The Northern Palatine Guard deployed on the edges of the burning port, occupying high parapets that overlooked the libraries and art galleries of the Nephirite district. Their commander, Catan Athea, was the heir apparent to one of Prospero's oldest families, a young and gifted officer with great potential. He anchored his defense on the Caphera Tholus and positioned his troops with a tactical acumen that would have been lauded by any of the Imperial Army officers' scolum. Yet it did not matter. Leman Russ and his Space Wolves overran Athea's position in less than 2 minutes. Tizca burned as dawn's light crept over the horizon. Yet, though the Space Wolves had struck an overwhelming blow, they had yet to face the city's true defenders. The Thousand Suns deployed, and suddenly the fight took on a very different character. Old Tizca was no more. The peaceful warren of antiquated streets was now ashes and burned rubble. Warriors picked careful paths through the smoldering ruins, firing from the hip or fighting with chain axes and chain swords. The coastline was invisible, obscured by fog banks of artillery fire. What had once been a wondrous beacon of illumination for all who cared to look upon it was now a maelstrom of battle. The northern spur of the city was a raging inferno, its palaces ablaze and its parkland ashen wastelands. Further south, the port was a giant black stain on the horizon, its structures demolished in the wake of the Space Wolves' attack. Though the majority of the Spire Guard had been swept away in the opening moments of the battle, the Thousand Suns rallied magnificently and prevented the battle from becoming a rout. A thin line of Astartes in crimson power armor linked the 6 pyramids of Tizca, forming a circular perimeter with the Oculum Square at its center. The Pyramid of Photep was the southernmost of the pyramids, the glittering water surrounding it awash with sodden pages of ancient wisdom lost forever in the name of fear. The Thousand Suns were dying. Scores of them died in the opening minutes of the Wolf King's attack, his fury unstoppable and his power unmeasurable. Clad in the finest suit of artificer armor and armed with a Fenrisian frostblade that clove warriors in two with single strokes, his fury was that of a pack hunter who knows his brothers are with him. His Huskarls were grimly efficient butchers of men, their Terminator armor proof against all but the luckiest shots and blade strikes. Though the Thousand Suns sorcerer librarians could not see the Sisters of Silence, they were still there, for the librarians' psychic powers were weakening. The warriors of the Legio Custodes slew with powerful strokes of their guardian spears, hewing ceramite and flesh alike with efficient strokes. The slaughter continued as the Space Wolves quickly thinned the ranks of the beleaguered Thousand Suns. The doom of the Thousand Suns would soon beat upon them, for fewer than 1,500 Astartes of the Legion remained alive, facing more than 3 times their number, and the fury of the Primarch like Leman Russ. This was a battle that could only end one way. Unable to oppose the brutality of the Space Wolves, the Thousand Suns finally relented, and unleashed their Maleficarum, their black sorcery, upon their foes. But by doing so, they had inadvertently justified the Imperial sanctions against them, for they were now truly no better than renegade warlocks and witches. Using their vile magics, the Thousand Suns pushed back the Space Wolf assaults, and slew a great number of the maddened warriors of Fenris. It seemed that the tide of battle had turned, and that the Thousand Suns might yet salvage the day. But soon, a new enemy opposed the sorcerers of Prospero. The Silent Sisterhood finally made their presence fully known, as the Null Maidens poured down from the black heaps of the burning rubble into the fight. They uttered no war cry, or challenges the blackness of their lack of presence, and the warp washed across the Thousand Suns' lines. The rank clouds of sorcery burned away, or blew aside like a fog in a night wind. The Thousand Suns choked on the words of their conjurations, gagging upon the utterances of their spells. They staggered back, clutching at their throats, pawing at the neck seals of their helms, blood spurting and leaking through their visor slits. Arcane gestures and motions ceased as their hands transformed into arthritic claws. Seconds after they had stunned and disempowered the sorcerers of the Thousand Suns with their insidious silence, the Sisters struck, surging through the recoiled mass of the Space Wolves, and began to hack and slice with their power swords. The Space Wolves moved alongside the Null Maidens to take advantage of the Thousand Suns wavering in their attacks. But the Thousand Suns managed to rally and concentrate their efforts against the untouchable warriors, thinning their ranks until they were able to once again make use of their psychic abilities. Now, some of the captains of the Thousand Suns attempted to reform their lines and launch a counterattack into a formidable lines of the Space Wolves. Using their psychic abilities, the Thousand Suns managed to drive a wedge into their foes' lines and firmly reestablish their defense. But this small victory was short-lived, with the arrival of the Wolf King and his bodyguard of Terminators. Realizing that their doom was finally upon them, the commanders of the Thousand Suns attempted to eliminate the Space Wolves' Primarch. Captain Aramangma of the Pyra cult attempted to slay the Wolf King by launching an attack of concentrated flame. This only momentarily staggered Russ, and he somehow managed to nullify the Arthritic attack and reflect Aramangma's attack upon him, incinerating him with his own warp-spawned fire. The Thousand Suns line could not hold against the unbridled savagery of Leman Russ, as their final stand was made in the shadow of the Pyramid of Photep. Shards of crystalline glass floated on the water surrounding Magnus the Red's lair. The surviving populace of Tizca, who had escaped the initial wrath of the invaders, sheltered within. The Thousand Suns also faced the wrath of the bestial Wolfen, the mutant Astartes of the Space Wolves that had suffered from the genetic curse of the Calyx Helix, contained within their gene seed. Their razor-sharp fangs and talons tore into the ranks of the battered Thousand Suns. Only the most accurate shots could put them down, and they shrugged off wounds that would have even killed an Astartes. Their claws tore through ceramite with ease, and their teeth were as vicious as any energized power blade. The Wolfen's single-minded savagery was unlike anything the Thousand Sons had fought before, and they fell back from these newly unleashed terrors, horrified that the Space Wolves would dare employ such degenerate, mutant abominations. The Wolfen punched a bloody hole in the Thousand Sons' line, tearing it wider with every second, and dozens of Astartes fell beneath the tearing blades of their claws. Howls of triumph filled the air, as the gap the Wolfen had opened was filled with Custodes and Space Wolf warriors. Bands of Thousand Sons were surrounded and hacked down by frost-bladed axe and glittering power fists of the Guardian spears. The Thousand Sons' first captain, Zeckthar, backed along the great basalt causeway, over the water towards the pyramid of Photep, their last refuge on Tizca. The best and bravest of the Legion, all that survived to sell their lives in sight of their Primarch, went with him towards the bronze gate that led inside. The howling of the Wolfen built to a deafening crescendo, and high above, these howls were finally answered. Magnus the Red finally answered the pleas of his dying sons as he made his presence known. He presented a glorious sight, clad in golden artificer armor, his wild red hair ablaze with psychic energy. His flesh burned with the touch of immense power, greater than anything had ever contained before. His bladed staff threw a blinding arcs of lightning that destroyed armored vehicles in thunderous explosions. Magnus swept his one good eye across the horrified Space Wolves, and all who met his gaze died in an instant as they were driven to madness by the Stygian depths of infinite chaos that they saw there. Only Leman Russ and his Fenrisian wolf companions stood unfazed by the sorcerous power of Magnus, a gleam of anticipation in the Wolf King's eyes, as though he relished the idea of the coming conflict with his brother. Using his powerful sorcery, Magnus slowed time down in order to issue his final orders to his most favored son and senior captain, bidding Ahriman to lead the surviving Astartes of the Thousand Sons within the pyramid of Photep. There Magnus's equerry Amon awaited him, bearing a priceless gift for Ahriman to bear away from Prospero. The Primarch reached down and touched the jade scarab in the center of Ahriman's breastplate. The crystal shone with a pale light, and Ahriman felt the immense power resting within it. Magnus explained that this crystal had been cut from the reflecting caves of Prospero, and that every Astartes of the Thousand Sons Legion bore one set in his power armor. When the moment came, Ahriman would know what it was meant to do, and that he was to concentrate all of his psychic energies on this crystal and those of his battle brothers. Not fully comprehending his Primarch's cryptic words, Ahriman reluctantly withdrew within the pyramids as instructed, followed by the remaining Thousand Sons as Magnus once more restored the flow of time to its proper course. Masses of people filled the pyramid of Photep, terrified civilians and exhausted soldiers of the Spire Guard. The Thousand Sons poured inside, their armor black and dripping from the nightmarish deluge of ash drowning the world beyond. The horrifying scale of loss staggered Ahriman. At a conservative estimate, he guessed that just over 1,000 Astartes had escaped the attack of the Wolfen. Only a tenth of the Thousand Sons Legion had survived the Space Wolves' furious assault. Pushing down his grief, Ahriman searched for Amon. The equerry held a chest up for Ahriman to open. Ahriman reached up and took hold of the lock, which snapped open at his touch. He opened the lid and drew in a breath as he saw the book within, its cover red and cracked with age. For it was none other than the legendary Book of Magnus, the complete summation of his Primarch's knowledge of sorcery and the warp. Ahriman understood with sudden clarity that Magnus had no expectation of surviving his duel with Leman Russ. It was then that the Crimson King and the Wolf King met in battle, with the fate of an entire world balanced on the outcome, and they fought like the gods of ancient Terran legends. Forking traceries of lightning shot upwards from the ground, isolating them from the host of Space Wolves and the Custodes. Russ rained down blow after blow on Magnus, shattering his horned breastplate, and in return, Magnus struck his brother with a searing blast of cold fire that cracked his armor and set light to his braided hair. The Wolf King's frost blade struck at Magnus, but his golden power axe turned the blow aside as they spun and twisted in an epic battle beneath the madness of a blazing storm of sheet lightning and pounding thunder. This was a battle fought on every level, physical, mental, and spiritual, and each Primarch bending every ounce of their almost limitless power to the other's destruction. Magnus used his powerful psychic magics, battering Russ with fists of telekinetic force wreathed in fire and lightning. Yet Russ was a Primarch, and such powers had little effect on him, save to drive him to greater fits of rage. Magnus drove his fist into Russ's chest, the icy breastplate cracking open, and shards of ceramite stabbed into the Wolf King's heart. In return, Russ snapped Magnus's arm back, shattering it into 1,000 pieces. A blade of pure thought unsheathed from Magnus's other arm, and he drove it deep into Russ's chest, through his shattered armor. The psychic blade burst from Russ's back, and the Wolf King let loose a deafening bellow of pain. A chorus from his Fenrisian wolves added their howls to that of their master. The two enormous lupine monsters that accompanied Russ leapt upon Magnus, fastening their jaws upon his legs. Magnus slammed his fist into the Black Wolf's head, driving it into the ground with a strangled yelp, its skull surely shattered. With a bellow of anger, Magnus tore the White Wolf from his leg with a thought and hurled it away over the heads of the army at Russ's back. Magnus and Russ were locked in battle high above the causeway of the pyramid, the furious horror of the struggle obscured by the ethereal fire and bursts of lightning. A flare of black light erupted, and Russ cried out in agony. His blade lashed out blindly and struck a fateful blow against Magnus's most dreaded weapon, his eye. Magnus reeled back from the Wolf King, one hand clutched to his eye, and his shattered arm crackled with regenerative energies. As broken and bloodied as Leman Russ was, he was a brawler enough to seize his opportunity. He barreled into Magnus and gripped him around the waist like a wrestler, roaring as he lifted his brother's body high above his head. All eyes turned to Russ as he brought Magnus down across his knee, and the sound of the Crimson King's back breaking tore through the heart of every Astartes of the 1,000 Suns. The Wolf King howled in triumph to the blackened heavens. Russ dropped Magnus to the mud and brought the Frostblade Molnar around to take the head of his defeated brother. With the last of his strength, Magnus turned his head, and his ravaged eye found his favorite son, Ahriman. "This is my last gift to you." Leman Russ's blade swept down. Before its lethal edge struck, Magnus whispered eldritch words of power, and his body underwent an instantaneous dissolution, its entire structure unmade with a word. And Ahriman gasped as vast and depthless power surged into his body. As it swept through him, he knew what he had to do. Ahriman clasped his hands upon the jade scarab, set in his breastplate. He knew everything about the gem, and pictured the identical artifact on the chest of each Astartes of the 1,000 Suns. Even as he visualized them, the power in him spread to the entire legion, as Magnus gave the last of his strength to save his sons, teleporting his beloved and infamous city of light, Tizca, from the surface Prospero, and through the warp and into the Eye of Terror, to rematerialize upon the demon world known as Sartorius, the planet of sorcerers. This new world preserved all of their precious knowledge, hidden within its libraries that the 1,000 Suns had gathered from all across the galaxy during the Great Crusade. And the 1,000 Suns were saved from their enemies, at the cost of their souls. Magnus had willingly sacrificed the flesh that had contained his essence, and in so doing had ascended to the more evolved form of Demon Prince, one free of the constraints of mortality and the limits of reality. He now appeared before his surviving sons as a large humanoid form wreathed in the light of stars and the power of infinite possibilities. With brilliant wings and a shimmering warp fire, Magnus the Red had become the first of the demon Primarchs, and later he ascended further to become a Lord of Change, a greater demon of Tzeentch. The 1,000 Suns themselves succumbed to the gift of their patron and true savior from the fall Prospero, the Chaos God Tzeentch, the full return of their aberrant genetic mutations, which threatened to turn all of the surviving 1,000 Suns into mindless, gibbering chaos spawn. Appalled by the return of the dreaded flesh change, Ahriman led a secret cabal of the most powerful 1,000 Suns sorcerer librarians, who had survived the fall of Prospero, and guided them in the invocations of the powerful demonic spell later known as the Rubric of Ahriman. The spell was successful, but its success came at a high price. Those battle brothers of the Legion who lacked psychic ability were transformed into living automatons, known as Rubric Marines, the Rubricae. Their bodies were reduced to dust, and their souls were forever sealed within their suits' power armor. Every joint magically sealed, forever trapping the souls within in a nightmarish existence of living death. The minority of 1,000 Suns Astartes who did possess psychic abilities, and so did not succumb to the rubric, soon found their psychic abilities increased to a tremendous degree by the power of the spell. The ritual also accomplished its goal, halting the dreaded mutations, both in the surviving sorcerers and their undead brethren. Magnus was enraged by Ahriman's audacious spell and what it had done to his sons, but was secretly pleased with the level of sorcerer's knowledge the Legion had attained through the metamorphosis. Confronting the Cabal who had carried out the rubric, Magnus nearly slew Ahriman in his rage, but Tzeentch intervened personally, sparing Ahriman's life, for he had proven to be a useful pawn and a living exemplar of the power of change. Magnus exiled Ahriman and his remaining collaborators from the planet of the sorcerers, and ordered them to forever roam the galaxy in search of understanding and knowledge of the true meaning of chaos, a quest that continues to this present day. All told, well over 30 million lives were lost in the prosecution of the Emperor's justice on Prospero. The vast majority of these deaths being those citizens of the Imperium on the planet at the time the Imperial Centaur's fleet arrived. Official records place the number of survivors from Prospero's civilian population at 0. And while in actuality there were certainly some thousands at large in the galaxy, or who potentially escaped with one of the few bands of Thousand Suns to leave the planet alive, as a people, the Prosperan branch of mankind was now extinct. Of the Thousand Suns, official records before 014.M41 no longer listed the Legion, assuming it was completely destroyed until the Siege of Terra. Again, the actual truth is somewhat different, but still places the losses incurred for the Thousand Suns on Prospero at the time of the fleet's arrival at near total, with the survivors scattered across the galaxy. Some of these Thousand Suns detachments, fighting in the Great Crusade elsewhere in the Imperium, were to be destroyed by their allies before the news of Prospero's destruction reached them. 2,000 under Centaur Rom of the Ninth Fellowship were slaughtered in their encampments by the Ultramarines, attached to the same force, and 300 veterans of the Seventh Fellowship were abandoned to their deaths during the assault of Makdor 8 by the Imperial Fist, to name but two of the more prominent cases. Of all the contingents of the Thousand Suns abroad in the galaxy, only 2 were known to have escaped Imperial justice. The majority of the Fourth Fellowship, some 5,000 Legiones Astartes, who abandoned their Great Crusade assignment after hearing the attack of Prospero, and a force perhaps of several thousand, the Sixth Fellowship, present at Zal Arkhad, as part of an agreement between the Legion and that distant and enigmatic Forge world. Worse still, for the Legion, the destruction of Prospero and their status as renegades left them bereft of all support and succor within the borders of the Imperium, no means to resupply or recruit, barring open piracy. The Centaur host fared somewhat better, taking combined casualties of perhaps 49,000 in total, and a far greater toll of munitions and machinery either destroyed or abandoned on Prospero. Driven by the cold rage of their Primarch Leman Russ to engage in some of the bloodiest fighting of the campaign, the Space Wolves suffered the heaviest casualties, with some 25,000 listed as killed in combat, and several thousand more besides, mostly the 13th Great Company simply listed as missing. The figure constituted a substantial amount of the Space Wolves' total strength, and by the formal outbreak of the Horus Heresy, a mere handful of solar months later, they'd had little chance to replenish their numbers. Just as serious for the Space Wolves was the expenditure of munitions and equipment. Such was the zeal with which they prosecuted the war on Prospero, that their reserves of such things were badly depleted and left them unable to engage in more than limited warfare during the early stages of the Horus Heresy. The Imperial Army units attached to the Centaur host, although an auxiliary, also suffered badly in the fighting, with an estimated 23,000 dead. Indeed, several units were simply disbanded or merged with other formations on their return to Terra. The Legio Custodes and Silent Sisterhood suffered relatively light casualties by contrast. Although considered the smaller relative size of these forces, they could still be considered severe. Perhaps more telling was the damage done to the Legio Custodes' mythical invincibility in the minds of some. For during the fighting on Prospero, some of their numbers had been engaged and beaten by mere space marines, a lesson that would be remembered by certain of the Astartes in later years. However, the wiser minds amongst the Legiones Astartes noticed the ease in which the Custodians had dispatched their kind in turn, and wondered uneasily if perhaps this had been the very task they had originally been made for. Well, on that note, that be it, folks. Thank you all for listening, and I hope you enjoyed this Vox. Feel free to like, follow, subscribe, and comment. And if you really like our stuff, go ahead and hit the join button to support us as members. Have a great day, and as always,
until next time, this is Zeckthar, signing off.